Hey everybody, this is my thoughts on a general topic, specifically the issue of when you play a particular game and it basically ruins the entire series or genre for you. I don't necessarily mean that in the sense that the game was so bad that it made you swear off the entire series, but rather that it makes going back to previous games in that series extremely difficult or just frustrating, or it makes going to other games in that genre frustrating because it's just so much better than the other ones. Now, I run into this kind of thing with sequels in a series all the time, where the sequel is just a hell of a lot better than the previous games, and if I jump in with that particular game, then it makes going back to the older ones a lot more difficult. It's why I generally try to go back and play the original games in the series first, before I move on to the next ones. Of course, that's not always practical. For example, with the Fire Emblem series, the first one that actually released in the West is the 7th game in the series. And while going back and playing 4, 5, and 6 isn't all that difficult, going back and trying to play 1, 2, or 3 is a much more difficult proposition because the norms that we expect after having played the likes of Fire Emblem 7 were not established until at least Fire Emblem 4. But what about games where all of them did get Western releases and it's just a matter of tracking down copies of them? Well, again, that's not always practical either. Sometimes older games in a series are prohibitively expensive to find. I mean, sure, you might be able to find newer entries in the series for either full price if they're a pretty new release, or something like 40, 30, 20 bucks, sometimes even less than that if they're a slightly older release. But if you're looking for something that came out in, say, the 90s or early 2000s, then chances are the used game market is going to bump up the price of that because they think they can get away with charging something like $100+ for it. Of course, that's assuming you can even find a copy of that game for sale anyway, so mileage is going to vary depending on what game you're looking for there. Suffice to say, though, if you can find copies of the older games for a reasonable price and get hold of them, then it makes sense to go from the very beginning of the series, as far back as you can anyway, and work your way forward, because if you don't do that, then going back to older games is going to be a lot more frustrating, because they're going to introduce more convenience features over time, they'll expand upon existing mechanics and refine them, they'll give you just more things to do in general, they'll get more comfortable with the writing, you'll just generally see improvements made over time. Obviously, some sequels are not necessarily going to be better than their predecessors, and some of them are going to be better in some ways but weaker in others, but that's just the way things go. As long as you're not running into situations where the games are just getting worse and worse and worse over time, like, say, the Battlefield series, a general rule of thumb is that going back to older games in a series after having played newer ones is going to be a bit of a frustrating experience because you're just not going to have access to the refinements that the later games bring. Thing is, as long as you keep those sorts of things in mind, it's not that big of a deal. You can generally work around issues like that. What's a lot more difficult to work with, though, is when you play one particular game that is just so much better than all of the other games in its genre that it basically ruins the entire genre for you. And I can really only think of one game that has done that for me, and that is Stardew Valley. I went into that game knowing that that particular genre, the sort of farming and life sim genre, was not really my kind of thing. At least I didn't think it was until I played Stardew Valley and actually turned out to enjoy it quite a lot. And so after having played that, I decided to give other games in that genre a try and see if I ended up liking those as well. So stuff like Harvest Moon, Story of Seasons, Rune Factory, and a bunch of other indie stuff as well. And while I have been able to get at least some enjoyment out of the Rune Factory games, probably because they tend to focus a bit more on the JRPG kind of stuff than they do on the actual farming and life simulation stuff, the general experience of trying to play other games in the same genre has been extremely underwhelming to say the least, whether it be the Harvest Moon or Story of Seasons games, which are kind of the titans of the genre, or whether it's indie games like My Time at Portia or World's Dawn or Littlewood or something like that. I just keep finding that a lot of these indie games are really lacking in one way or another. Sometimes it's just general jankiness with the engines they're made on. Like, World's Dawn, for example, is made on the RPG Maker engine, and that makes everything ridiculously clunky and tedious to mess around with, because that engine was just not designed for that style of gameplay, and it really shows. Other times it's because there's performance issues, or there's just a lot of grinding, or the mechanics themselves are just really basic or the writing's just not very good. Sometimes a combination of multiple of those, and it just ends up being a situation where I'll go into one of these types of games and I'll just keep finding things that annoy me about them and not really finding all the things that made Stardew Valley so enjoyable. And then when I started going into the Harvest Moon and Story of Seasons games in particular, I was finding that while they might run decently and look fine and generally play fine, there's just soulless, for lack of a better way of describing them. They just don't have that immense charm that Stardew Valley did, and that sense that the developers were really putting their heart and soul into it like you get with Stardew Valley. Remember, Stardew Valley is the passion project of a single developer. It was made by one guy, and it is incredibly impressive that he managed to make what he did. But it was just a really weird experience going into Story of Seasons, Friends of Mineral Town, and Pioneers of Olive Town, as well as Harvest Moon Light of Hope, and finding that not only are these games basically completely soulless and devoid of any passion from the developers, but they're not even as refined as Stardew Valley is. I mean, I understand that Friends of Mineral Town is a remake of a GBA game, so it would understandably be a bit less refined than more recent entries in the series. It was just especially weird going into Pioneers of Olive Town and Light of Hope and finding that not only are they nowhere near as refined as Stardew Valley is, but they're also nowhere near as well written, they're nowhere near as interesting, they don't have anywhere near the charm that Stardew Valley does. And it's like the developers were just going through the motions, like they just didn't care and wanted to get the game out just so they could make a quick buck off of the license. So while it's not necessarily that these games are outright bad, it's just that they're so bland that it's pretty much impossible to give a crap about them. And while I wasn't running into the same issues quite as severely with the Rune Factory series, the only ones of those I've messed around with so far are Rune Factory 4 Special and Rune Factory 5, although I do have a copy of Tides of Destiny sitting on my shelf waiting for me to get around to it. The general experience of both of the Rune Factory games I have played were pretty messy as well. I mean, Rune Factory 4 Special is a port of a 3DS game. It's gonna be a bit messy no matter what you do. And Rune Factory 5 has the problem of running like hot garbage on the Switch, so that really doesn't help. But even once you get past some of the more technical stuff, you find that going from Rune Factory 4 to Rune Factory 5, you have a similar problem with going into the more recent Harvest Moon or Story of Seasons games, where it just feels like they were kind of going through the motions. Now, thankfully, Rune Factory hasn't quite gotten as bad in that regard as Story of Seasons or Harvest Moon yet, but it's still frustrating to me that after having gone through Stardew Valley, the only other games in the genre I've been able to get much of anything out of are the ones that put way more emphasis on elements that don't really have much of anything to do with the life and farming sim stuff. And thus I'm just left with this really weird situation where I went into Stardew Valley thinking that I probably wouldn't like it because the genre didn't seem like it'd be up my alley, but then I ended up enjoying Stardew Valley quite a lot, which then opened the doors for the whole genre for me, only to find that none of the other games in the genre are anywhere near as good as Stardew Valley. At least, none of the other ones I've messed with anyway, and unfortunately I have a feeling that it's going to remain that way even as my experience with that genre continues to increase. I think what's ultimately going to be the deciding factor here is whether or not the other games in this genre I mess with manage to do something that truly sets them apart from what Stardew Valley manages to do. I mean, after all, Rune Factory has the dungeon crawling JRPG stuff, which definitely sets it apart, and something like, say, My Time at Portia focuses way more on building and mechanics and things like that, as opposed to just farming and life sim stuff like what Stardew Valley primarily does. But what does this mean for all of the other games in the genre that are basically rendered obsolete by Stardew Valley, like apparently the entire Story of Seasons and Harvest Moon series? Honestly, I really don't know. There are a lot of games in the Harvest Moon and Story of Seasons series, and while the spin-off Innocent Life might actually be kind of interesting because it goes into more of a sci-fi direction, I don't really look at all of the other Harvest Moon games and see anything that Stardew Valley didn't already do and probably do better. So honestly, it might just be a complete waste of time and money to even attempt messing around with any of the other Harvest Moon and Story of Seasons games, except maybe the first couple of them as a bit of a historical curiosity. I certainly don't want to write off the entire series, but based on what I've experienced thus far, that may just be the best option here. I really don't know at this point. I haven't made a decision yet on that. But regardless of what I end up deciding on that, it's just an incredibly frustrating situation, because I went into the other games in this genre thinking that Stardew Valley was going to open the doors to an entirely new set of gaming experiences, only to find out that Stardew Valley is actually a paragon of its genre rather than just a really good example of one. So I'm not really sure what to do with that information. I mean, I haven't written off other genres because one particular example of them was just so much better than all of the other ones that it made them all obsolete. I mean, I certainly haven't written off tactical first-person shooters because of Rainbow Six 3 Raven Shield, for example. I haven't written off old-school style first-person shooters because of the original Doom or Duke Nukem 3D. I haven't written off real-time strategy games because of Age of Empires 2 or role-playing games because of Arcanum, or beat-em-ups because of Streets of Rage 2, or any number of other genres where I've played really great examples of them that managed to raise the bar for the entire genre, but didn't ruin it for all of the other games in that genre. Certainly not to the degree Stardew Valley did, and that's what makes this one ultimately so striking to me, because I really can't think of another game that has done this to an entire genre quite like Stardew Valley does. I mean, it's relatively common for a game within its own series to basically ruin all of the previous games, or maybe even some of the subsequent games, but it's not something you see on an entire genre scale, so I'm curious if there's anything like that that has happened for any of you watching this. Feel free to throw in the comments below whether there's been a particular game in a certain genre that has basically ruined the entire genre for you just because it was so much better than all of the other ones, because I'm legitimately curious if any of you have run into a similar issue. So let's go ahead and get that discussion going in the comments. Thank you all very much for watching. If you like my videos, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. All the revenue from that goes directly back into the channel. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that is perfectly fine. I understand. But the option's there if you're interested. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all in later videos.